Well, thank you for the privilege of sharing with you briefly this afternoon. Don't worry, I am not known for long sermons, and not only is this not a sermon, you need to realize it's just some comments I'm making to you. The blessing to you is there's no offering that's taken place after this is over with. But you know, in over 60 years of ordained ministry, in fact, the end of November, I will have been ordained for 60 years, had 4 years of student pastor before then. In all that time, the most common question asked of me is, what shall I say? A person going to the funeral home, person going to the hospital, person going to see somebody in the home where there's been tragedy or sickness or death, the question is, what should I say? Early in the ministry, I think I was a little flippant. At least my wife told me I was. I used to say, when you find out what to say, let me know so I'll know what to say, because that's always a mystery. And then finally, I've come to the place where I would say nothing. Say nothing. The ministry of presence is much more effective than the ministry of words. A good friend of mine, Joe Bishop, was a pastor in Rye, New York. He had a son, Peter, as Linda and I have a son, Peter. We talked about our sons quite often. Joe had to call me one day and tell me his son, Peter, who was a great kid, going into the ministry just like his dad, had volunteered in a summer camp up in New Hampshire, and on the way home at night, he went off the road, hit a tree, and was killed. Joe was well known. He received many phone calls. He received many cards. But he told me, he said, Rev, you know, the most meaningful call was from the local rabbi who called me in the middle of the night and simply said, Joe, I'm with you, and hung up. The ministry of presence, I'm with you. Not a lot of words. One of my very first encounter with that, and I'm a slow learner, but I was at the Lithopolis Presbyterian Church. If anybody knows the area, Lithopolis, a wonderful community. They had the Wagnall Scholarship. I enjoyed myself there, but the very first Sunday I was there, Friday I'd been an engineer at Battelle. Saturday we'd moved into a rickety air-conditioned house. It was air-conditioned because the wind blew through it, you know, winter and summer alike. But we were happy there for 4 years. The first Sunday I'm in the pulpit, they're calling me Reverend. I'm scared to death. I carry a Bible with a concordance in case somebody asks me a question. I haven't been to seminary one day. And after the service, there's a lady who says, I'd like to have you call on my mother this afternoon. She's not doing very well. My first pastoral call. Went home, had a little bit to eat after the services in the 3 churches. Went to the lady's house. She greeted me. She took me over to her bedroom and opened the door and said, Mother's in here. I know you want to be with her alone. She closed the door. I did not want to be with her alone. I went in and she was breathing very heavily. I didn't really know what to do. Finally, I decided, I'd seen it in movies. I knelt beside her bed and I decided the best thing to do was read the 23rd Psalm. So I read that to her, and when I finished reading it, I noticed there was no more laborious breathing. That lady had had the nerve to die right while I was there. I waited a while. I thought the daughter would be upset. The lady, I thought she'd want to be with her mother. But I went out and told her, I think your mother has died. I said, oh, I'm so glad you were with her. That meant so much to her. I don't know really whether it meant anything to her or not, But it evidently meant something to the daughter because the experience I've had and the experience of the rest of you have had, sometimes a person wants to be with a loved one when that loved one dies. Sometimes a person doesn't want to be there. They're afraid of it. But I learned there those words. It was so important for that lady for me to be there. The ministry of presence, not a lot of words, just sitting there, listening to her breathe, and then realizing she was gone to be with the Lord. As I said, I'm a slow learner, but it was soon after that we moved to Central College up by Westerville. We were at a wonderful church there for 48 and a half years. One of my early Sundays, the youth group came over to have fellowship at the house. My good wife had a good supper for them. It was great just talking with the kids, getting acquainted with them, discovering who were going to be leaders, with whom I could work. One young boy stood out more than any other, the young Crosby boy. After they went home, we cleaned up, getting ready to go to bed. The phone rang. I was told that the Crosby boy had been rushed to the hospital. I couldn't believe it. He'd been so alive, so animated, so filled with life and laughter. I dressed, went down to the hospital, arrived just at the time that the doctor had to come in and tell the mother that the boy had died. Burst appendix, they couldn't do anything about it, and they lost him. Again, what do you do when you're confronted with a situation like that? We hadn't been there long enough to get into that hugging stages. We were still somewhat strangers with each other. And all of a sudden, a friend of the lay mother broke into the room, took her by the arms and almost shook her and said, Jane, you got to realize this is the will of God. This is the will of God. And then she started talking about the will of God, preaching a sermon which I thought was most inappropriate. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say, why don't you hush up? I'd use stronger words, but I got to be careful. I didn't think that was the time for words. In fact, I've learned over the years there is a time when silence is much better than words. There's a time to discuss the will of God. That'll be next Monday when the 9 chaplains from the patrol gather and we have a theological discussion on the will of God. That's an appropriate place for it. But to try and tell somebody who's just lost her son that that's the will of God. Later, Jane and I spent time together. But a lot of the time we spent at first was just sitting, not saying anything, because I believe so strongly in the ministry of presence. A young man was not coming to church with his wife. His wife came on the church bus. Yes, there was once upon a time a church bus in the life of Central College Church. They called it Puff, the magic dragon. It was magic that it made it back to the church after it left. And if any of you are considering going into the ministry, and we could use a lot of good people like you, don't make the mistake I did of getting a CDL and then being available to drive the church bus. That's a mistake. Been all over the country driving a church bus. But the mother came with the children, the father did not. So I asked the mother, should I go call on your husband? No, don't call on him. I didn't know why, but all of a sudden, he appeared with her one Sunday. Then he appeared with her another Sunday. As he'd leave the church in that pagan practice of saying something to the pastor, every Sunday, oh, that was a great sermon. You didn't really listen, but you tell him it was a great sermon anyway. He never spoke. I'd greet him, tell him it's so great to be here, and he'd go, whoa. That's about all. He became a regular attendee, and then, tragically, he was home with the 1-year-old boy while the mother took the other children out shopping. And the 1-year-old boy sitting in the high chair with the father there next to him, choked to death on a peanut. They called me. I went down. I saw Dan. No words. We sat together. He didn't avoid me. I tried to ask him a few questions about what he wanted in the way of a funeral service. He said not one word. At the funeral home, I sat with him. Everybody else was talking to the wife and to the other relatives. I just sat with Dan. No conversation at all. Not a word. After the funeral, I went and visited. Not a word. It's challenging to sit with a person for up to an hour and not have any communication at all. I would ask a question now and then, but he'd never ask. And as I went to leave, I said, Dad, do you want me to come back? Yes. A word. His wife came to me and said, Rev, will you please go back and see Dan? I said, yes, I will. And she said, you're the only one he's talked to. And I said, he just said one word. She said, honestly, that's the only word I think he's spoken. Well, strangely enough, just by seeing him, he wouldn't even ask me if I wanted a cup of coffee. He got to know that. He'd get the coffee and put it down, and I'd sit with him. Slowly but surely, over weeks and time, he began to talk. Right now, if I took out my cell phone and called him to tell him I had a flat tire in the parking lot here, he'd be here fast as he could. He might even beat the patrol to get my tire fixed. My point is that he has told me later, thank you for just sitting with me. The ministry of silence is very effective. Dan and I are very close right now. He'd do anything he could, and I'd do anything for him. But we can sit sometimes and have lunch together or a snack, and we don't have to have a lot of talk. We're comfortable together. But that got him over a hump somehow, just somebody being willing to accept him in the ministry of just being there. One of the blessings I had at Central College Church was having a nun come and be on my church staff. Now, we were Presbyterians. I was raised a Baptist, so how do you get a mongrel Baptist Presbyterian to have a nun on his church staff? She was a lovely lady. Used to see her in the hospital. She'd call me and she'd say, Rev, I got a Protestant over here. I don't know what to do with him. Get over here. So I'd get over to the emergency room. I kept saying to Mary, when are you going to come be my associate? Now, my friends, I was kidding. Because Presbyterian elders just don't vote to call Roman Catholic nuns. Well, she had some challenges with one of the habits she had in her life. Finally got that straightened out. She came back after a leave of absence. She got a phone call to me and said, may I see you? And I said, absolutely, I'll come over to the hospital. She said, no, I want to see you in your study. So she came over and sat down and she said, I'm ready to be your associate. What do I do? I said, well, you convert from Roman Catholicism. And then I laughed. I said, Mary, I don't know, but we'll see what we can do. And the elders voted to have her come be a miniature visitation to the seniors. I told her, you're going to be called Mary in a Protestant church. She says, that's all right with me. That was what I was named. But everybody called her Sister Mary. They loved her. In fact, they could have used her for the senior pastor, and I could have gone out to pasture. But Mary and I would go make calls together on the elderly, the shut-ins, sometimes retirement village. And on the way, I would ask her, Sister Mary, what's the Pope say about you going out with a Presbyterian minister to do communion? She'd say, Rev, if you won't tell him, I won't tell him. We got along beautifully. But it was interesting what happened, and I saw a dynamic. We get to the home, prepare the elements, she would. I would talk to the person, some I hadn't seen as she had seen in her visitations, have communion, and then she'd put the elements away, settle down in the chair and go sleep. And I would end up visiting with the person. And the person would lower the voice and said, I think I'm doing Sister Mary a favor because when she comes here, she catches up on her sleep and a nap. And here was interesting that the person being visited felt the ministry of presence with Mary. And it was so comfortable that Mary could go to sleep. And the person to whom we were ministering thought that person was becoming a minister to the one who was there to minister, if you follow what I said. It was an interesting dynamic, and Mary did that for 15 years. Truly a blessing. But it proved to me it's not the words we say, it's just being there with the person. 3 years ago, this last April, I lost my wife. Steve, you have 14 years, I think.
Yes.
Well, we had 65, and they were wonderful. And she taught me that there's something very important about communication as a married couple. She taught me that silence, if it's not a silence because of an unresolved conflict, but if it's a silence that says, I'm comfortable with you, that's a beautiful, beautiful communication. We drove lots of places. Drove to Florida, drove out west, with and without our kids. And we could go for miles and not say a word. But that wasn't because we were upset with each other. It was because we were comfortable with each other. Sometimes, even as old ducks holding hands. Yes, I could drive a car with one arm, and do a good job. Not the motorcycle, but the car. But just being together with somebody they're comfortable. Again, the ministry of just companionship. It's very important. Well, I lost Linda 3 years ago, this last April. And there was quite an evening of visitation because of the connection with the patrol, because of being in the same community for nearly 50 years in the church, a large church. I dreaded the idea of the visitation, the funeral home, but it's something we do. And there was an individual who was there before I was. And that individual stayed till I left. And that individual, I don't think, spoke more than 2 or 3 words to me. At one point in the visitation, he suggested that Chief Jackson, the Columbus Division Police Chief, was there and he couldn't stand in line. Maybe I should go see him. That's the only communication I had with this person, except for eye contact. Just to acknowledge, I'm with you. I'm there with you. That meant a lot to me. It still resonates with me. That person was ministering to me more than he realized, and that was Colonel Paul Pride. Took the whole evening just to be there. We don't have to say the words. Our presence expresses the concern. One lady in receiving visitation at a funeral home told me, if one more person comes up and says, I'm sorry, I'm going to slap them. Says, I know they're sorry or they wouldn't be here. Why can't they just say, I love you or I'm with you? We don't have to go through the whole theological explanation of the will of God just to say, I'm with you, just to be there, just to touch occasionally, a fleeting pass to say, here I am. I close with an example that's very pertinent. We had 5 children. We lost one. But at one time, we had a little cabin over at Buckeye Lake before we built the house in which we're living. It was 1 bedroom, not very large at that. And the children, all 5, we had 4 girls and a boy, slept in that 1 bedroom. I was surprised the twins, who were 16 years older than their kid brother, would sleep in the same room, but it was fun. 2 sets of bunk beds and a cot that slept under the 1 bunk. Well, I made a practice during vacation times of putting the kids to bed. Granted, the older girls didn't need any help from me, but we all went in and I would tell them a story, usually a made-up story about Harvey the invisible rabbit. And then I would sing lullaby and good night. And finally, one of the twins spoke up and said, Dad, we really enjoy your presence with us when we go to bed. But you can keep quiet, you don't have to sing. The ministry of presence is very important. I think we ought to practice it more often and not always try and get tangled up in the ministry of words. God bless you all for what you do. Thanks for letting me share with you.